And in 1945, he found the instruments through things like FHA finance, the kind of financial support, the tax deductions on home ownership, mortgage interest, all those kinds of things. He found the wherewithal, the institutional arrangements, if you like, which could permit this new project of urbanization to set underway. And my thesis here is that in many ways, capitalism was rescued, not only in the United States, but globally, by the suburbanization and the reorganization of the economy of the United States. It wasn't only suburbanization, it was also the construction of the California economy, the southern region, the movement to the south and the west and so on, so that you start to see this movement occurring in the 1950s and 1960s, which is a phenomenal absorption of capital surpluses, not only in the infrastructures, and again, but through the construction of an alternative lifestyle. Because in exactly the same way that Haussmann was not simply about infrastructures, but it was about the transformation, the construction of a consumerist lifestyle, so you find in the 1950s and 1960s a lot of the surplus is being consumed by things like the refrigerators and the air conditioners and the two cars in the garages and the gas consumption and all the rest of it. So suburbanization is also about a transformation of human personality, and also it's around individualized home ownership that becomes, if you like, one of the key elements of this thing. And so you start to find the emergence of a suburban politics, the articulation of a different sense of who we are and what we're about. And that kind of transformation, which occurred in the 1950s and 1960s, was a very, very important way in which, in creating that world of the suburbs, we actually were transforming human personality, human attitudes, social attitudes, politics, and all the rest of it. This system worked extremely well up until about the mid-1960s. Then it started to get in a little bit of trouble. And it got into trouble for almost exactly the same reasons that Haussmann got into trouble. By the time you get to the end of the 1960s, you find people starting to say, this is no way to think about city life. And suddenly you find Jane Jacobs comes riding upon the scene and starts saying all these kinds of things about, this is a destruction of neighborhoods, it's a destruction, here is Moses taking a meat axe to the Bronx and all that kind of thing. You can't do that sort of thing, this is destruction. We have to think about a different kind of way in which the urban can be actually reconstituted around the ideas of neighborhood, about, the corner shop, and eventually, of course, about the local cafe and all of that kind of thing. We have to think about that. So there's an aesthetic opposition, there's a living, if you like, a daily life opposition beginning to emerge to Moses. But by the time you get to 1970, 71, you start to find actually all of those financial institutions which were there start to have a real problem. A real problem. And the financial institutions have been debt financed, and as happened to Haussmann, suddenly people start to ask some questions. What's inside of this? And they suddenly find in 1973 that there's nothing much inside there. And I can show you, there's a great diagram in this book, The Condition of Postmodernity, where I can show it to you. It's about what happened in the real estate market around, you probably can't see it, but what it shows, you have to buy the book, you see. The thing is the annual rate of change in mortgage debt in the United States, and there's a line that goes along here up until around 1969, then it zooms up in 1974, and then it totally crashes in 1973. Okay? This one is the stock exchange values of real estate investment trusts, which are doing this kind of thing, and then they go almost down to zero in 1973, 74. And the bottom one is the property share values on the London stock market, way up and then crash in 1973, 74. In other words, the global property market crashes in 1973, 74, and this is the beginnings of the serious recession of the 1970s. It all began in the urban world of the property markets. And remember that, it's usually said it began with the Arab oil embargo and the oil price hike, as probably this one will be written as being all about the oil price hike, when actually the thing began in March, the oil price hike didn't happen until October. And so it was a real estate property crash. All the financial institutions start to crumble around the property market. New York City goes bankrupt in 1975, technically, and you have the New York fiscal crisis and all the other things that I wrote about in that other book over there, if you want to read about that. So suddenly this whole thing goes crashing down in the 1970s. The urban project ends up. But also, ask yourself a little bit about what was the content of the '68 movement. In Paris, switch back over there for the moment, one of the issues which was crucial in Paris was what they called the invasion of Paris by the monsters, which were the high-rises which were coming into the Place d'Italie and the Tour Montparnasse, and so there was a massive movement in Paris in the 60s to try to protect Paris from this process of reorganization along modernist lines. The highway down the left bank was planned, a lot of political resistance to that. So quality of urban lifestyle was a big issue in the '68 movement in Paris. I'd like to argue that antagonism to the suburban lifestyle was a big part of the origins of the '68 movement in this country. Actually, if you look at first wave feminism, and you read some of the literature of first wave feminism, their undeclared enemy, which they often talk about, is the suburban lifestyle. That is what they're against. You get a lot of white kids in the suburbs who find the suburbs so boring and so bland that they want something different. And they formed the core of the student movement that became a very important part of the '68 movement. Then in alliance with the impacted populations of the central cities, started to talk about there is a different kind of urban lifestyle which can be constructed here. So the '60s movement was not absent an urban dimension. But notice, it was in many ways the uneven geographical development between suburbs and cities that here played actually a very crucial role in the unfolding of the politics of the time, and it's played a crucial role, of course, ever since, in the sense that the suburban vote, if you want to call it that, has become dominant in the United States, and we're still in that sort of situation of a suburban lifestyle, but now the inner suburbs in particular are beginning to go down the chute, so we're beginning to see a radical transformation here. But again, it was a construction of the lifestyle and the new financial institutions which came unpacked. Now, let's look at our present situation. It's very interesting to me that you go around the world, as I've been privileged to do, and in every city you go to, you're immediately struck by how true this argument is, initially made in a UN report and then, later articulated very strongly by Mike Davis, that we're living in a world of slums. And the slums are growing. They're getting bigger and bigger. And everybody's kind of saying, what are we going to do about them? And everybody concentrates on the slums. But the other thing that strikes me about when I go to one of these cities, struck me most forcibly when I went to Santiago in Chile. You arrive at the airport and you're driving in from the airport and you're going past all the slums. And then as you get towards the center of town, all of a sudden up the other end of Santiago, you see a huge set of complexes of high rises. Condominiums and office towers and things like that, which they refer to as Little Manhattan. And when you're in Mumbai, you look at one of the slums there, and in the middle of it, there are these vast condominiums. Almost every city in the world at this point is not only a slum bound, but it's also a vast building system. A huge, huge kind of investment of surplus capital going into urbanization. And some of the crazy sides of that are places like, Dubai or something. I mean, you look at the architecture of Dubai and you kind of go, does this make sense to spend all this money on these vast kinds of things with ski slopes inside of shopping malls and, what the hell is going on? I mean, couldn't they think of better things, ways to spend their surpluses than to absorb it in ridiculous projects of this kind? And actually, you're going all around the place. I was in Spain recently, and the ridiculous projects that are going on in Spanish cities are just absolutely crazy. And vast shopping malls emerging all over the place, which don't seem to make much sense either. And the big place for it, of course, is China.